For today's business brief, we're joined by John Kehoe, senior writer for the Australian Financial Review. John, there's been quite some reaction to the coalition win, hasn't there, particularly on the markets?
Yeah, well, the markets have really been going gangbusters the last couple of days. A bit of a relief rally, particularly certain sectors like banking and healthcare, just relieved that some of those extra regulations that potentially could have come under Labor are not going to happen. So certainly the investors are happy. What happens to the actual real economy over the coming months, though, remains to be seen.
What about the RBA? Another decision looming as it does every month. Is it likely that a cut is now on the cards, and has the election changed that?
Yeah, Laura, we're almost certainly going to see an interest rate cut in 2 weeks' time. The RBA Governor, Philip Lowe, signalled that yesterday. Interestingly, he avoided doing that during the election campaign. He could point out that since he put rates on hold last month, that there has been sort of subdued wage growth data and the unemployment rate ticked up to 5.2%. But the more interesting thing, I think, in his speech yesterday in Brisbane was the fact that he was putting pressure on federal and state governments to do more on potentially infrastructure spending, but also serious economic reform as well to try and boost growth. Tax reform, maybe labour market sort of stuff, skills, education, training. And basically he's signalling the RBA is soon going to run out of ammunition. The rates are already really low at 1.5%. They're going to get down towards 1% and can't go a lot lower than that. Really, governments probably need to step in with more potential infrastructure spending if the economy weakens more, and particularly economic reform, because it can't all be left up to the RBA. So that's something the Morrison government is going to have to start grappling with.
And the APRA lending requirements, how do they feed into that? Yeah,
so the banking regulator yesterday just slightly easing some of the requirements banks are forced to assess potential borrowers. So at the moment, they're forced to assume that a borrower could afford to repay a 7% interest rate. Now, that's pretty unrealistic in these days because interest rates are so low. You know, your average mortgage rate's down around 4% or so. So they're dropping that requirement essentially to about 2.5% above what your borrowing rate is, so maybe 6.5%. So that essentially means borrowers might be able to borrow up to about maybe $50,000 more per year for your typical single borrower. And so that might just help with credit growth because that has been slow. The banks have been making it harder to borrow in recent months in wake of the Royal Commission. So it might just give the housing market a bit of a boost.
Yeah, well, we'll see with that. Also, timing of the tax cuts. There was a bit of back and forth yesterday about tax cuts legislation not passing through the Parliament before June 30. Sort this out for us, John. If they're not, does it mean they're delayed by a year, or the government can just essentially backdate it retrospectively?
Yeah. Look, I think this is a bit of a storm in a teacup, at least in an economic sense, because it might be difficult to legislate these before June 30, but it was always going to be a rebate or a refund after you file your tax return in the new financial year anyway. So that wasn't likely to happen until September, October for a lot of people anyway. So if it gets legislated in early July, it's only going to be a slight delay anyway. I guess Morrison said it would be before June 30. He may have misled a little bit there, but really the real sense of it is it's not going to make much difference.
And John, finally, Chris Bowen is in the mix for the leadership.
Yeah.
Certainly talking to people in Labor, they don't think he's much chance of winning that ballot. Why is he having a go at the leadership when really Anthony Albanese is the raging favourite?
Yeah, it's interesting he's thrown his hat in the ring, Chris Bowen. A little bit of blame being levelled his way for the election loss on some of the tax policies. I would point out, though, you know, some of his colleagues put up these big spending proposals and him as Treasurer had to find a way to pay for all these, and he's being sort of targeted for the tax rises. Well, you've also got to look at all the people who are offering this big spending and how to afford it. But I think Chris Bowen's sort of political future now very much hinges on how he does in this leadership contest, because if he loses the leadership contest, he's probably going to struggle to retain the Treasury portfolio because the deputy leader, whoever that is, will get to choose their portfolio. And if it's someone like Jim Chalmers, for example, you could very well imagine that he might choose that Treasury portfolio. So this is a really big contest for Chris Bowen and the future of his political career, I believe.
Absolutely. Spot on, John. Couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for that. We'll speak to you soon.